Hi, everybody. I'm April Woodard, and welcome to Conversations in Chaos, Race and Unrest. Now, protesters have taken to the street now to day 10, and they were moved by the murder of George Floyd by an ex-Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin. Wednesday, the charges against the officer were elevated from third-degree murder to second-degree, and the other three fired officers were charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. Today, we also had a memorial for Mr. Floyd, where a lot of civil rights activists as well as celebrities attended. And folks stood up for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to focus on the fact that that's how long George Floyd had the officer's knee in his neck until he died. Today, we're going to talk about some of the issues that made the Floyd murder a tipping point that led to protests. My first guest is the author of several books, including this one, which is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? I would like to welcome now President Emerita of Spelman College, Dr. Beverly Tatum. Dr. Tatum, first of all, why do you think the death of so many unarmed men and women at the hands of police wasn't enough to spark this, but George Floyd's case was the one to make the world take to the streets and protest?
In this case, there was no defense for that behavior. It was indefensible. And I think because it came at a time following the shooting of Breonna Thomas, Ahmaud Arbery, so many names, we can hardly keep them all straight. The fact of the matter was that this one was just so dramatic. It was like the straw that broke the camel's back for many people.
Yeah,
and sure. I think particularly for white people, it was so shocking. Think about this question. White viewers might ask themselves, have I ever seen a white person being killed at the hands of police in that way on a viral video? I can't ever remember such an instance. And so it is just clear evidence that there is differential treatment, unjust treatment of African Americans in our society today still.
I just wanted to share with my audience that didn't get a chance to see the first few seconds. This is the author of this wonderful book that I think that everybody should have a copy of. Dr. Tatum is joining us today to talk about race, and she's a clinical psychologist also, and a former president of Spelman. I also want to introduce a man that I admire deeply. He is the pastor and CEO and founder of Favor Nation Church. And he also has a background in Wall Street, in addition to he is a counselor, he's a life coach. And the biggest part is that he's my husband. I want to welcome Pastor Adrian. How are you, Pastor? Okay, there you go. There you go. All right. So, Pastor A, I want to ask you the same question that I asked Dr. Tatum. Why do you think that this was a tipping point for people to go out into the streets after all of the cases that we've been seeing? I mean, going back to Rodney King in '92. I can't hear you, Pastor. I can't hear you. Do you have your mic on? I can't hear you. Okay, well, we'll keep trying. Hold on. Yeah, I'm not hearing you. No. Okay. Well, let's work on that, and then let me introduce the next guest. Okay. Is that good? Okay. All right. And my next guest, we're interested in getting Pastor A's perspective on this. My next guest is actually one who's very dear to my heart. She is one of my former students. She's a graduating student, an alum of Hampton University, and she is Miss Hampton. I got to ask you, are you going to get to keep your title for 2 years since I don't know what's going on? Carmen, welcome.
Hi, how are you guys?
Good.
Greetings.
I honestly don't want to keep my title. I think that it's important that I'm able to pass it down to the next young lady to truly fulfill this role. I think it's a growing role, and you have to know when to put it aside and your time to leave. So I'm excited for whoever is next.
Oh, great. So I want to ask you the same question. Why do you think the Floyd case was the one that made everything erupt?
Honestly, it goes back to what you were saying. George Floyd and the woman who recorded it, it's clear. It's clear that the officer was on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. And we see that he is repeatedly saying, I can't breathe. He's calling out for his mother. He's calling out for help. And all of the cops within that, they weren't really doing anything. They were all just standing. They were telling people to move or get off the street. And I think that this isn't the first time that we've seen something on camera. And I think that since we saw the Breonna story, since the Ahmaud story came, and it was like a back-to-back hit for my generation, I think that enough is enough and we're tired. It's no longer acceptable. It was never truly acceptable, but at this point, I love how my generation is becoming and getting active and going out in the streets and saying this isn't enough, signing petitions, donating to these families. There are different ways you can protest. So I think seeing that vividly and clearly on that video and having it, it was truly something within us. I said, okay, we can't sit back and take it anymore.
Right. Absolutely. I want to invite you guys to ask questions and comments to Dr. Tatum, Pastor Woodard, and Ms. Jackson as well. So send those to us and we'll try to get to them at the end of the show. Dr. Tatum, I want to talk to you a little bit about something that you broke down very easily when you were here. And first, I want to remind folks about the conversation that took place this week earlier with Charlemagne and Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh told him he does not buy into the notion of white privilege. So for folks out there that don't understand what white privilege is, or don't buy into it or don't believe it, or for those of us who have difficulty explaining it to people, Dr. Tatum, break it down like I'm a fifth grader.
Well, first of all, the idea of white privilege is the idea not that you've been born with a silver spoon in your mouth or that everything has been easy for you, but simply that there are benefits, advantages that come to a person who is white in the society, whether they want those benefits or privileges. They don't have to ask for them. They just come, and they don't, sometimes may not even be aware that they're having them. Perhaps Rush Limbaugh is one of those people who's unaware of the privilege he gets. When he walks into a store, is anybody following him around?
Right.
The freedom to walk around without being suspected of a crime just because you are white is a privilege. Being able to know that you are going to have access to a certain quality of healthcare just because you are white is a privilege. But you might not know those things unless you are comparing your treatment on a daily basis to the treatment of an African American or another person of color.
Yeah.
You know, if you get in your car, go to work, and come home without being pulled over by a police officer, you might not say to yourself, gosh, I had the privilege of coming home unharassed by a police officer today. You might not be thinking that. But if you're regularly having that experience, Philando Castile, before he was shot by that police officer in Minneapolis a few years ago, had been pulled over more than 30 times. Just for working and doing his job on a daily basis. That was just part of his daily life. So I have a colleague who has written a book, and in his book, he talks about, his name is Nolan Cabrera. In his book, he uses a different phrase, not white privilege, but he calls it white immunity. And that might be a phrase that some people might identify with more readily, because what he's really saying is that privilege gives you some immunity. You're immune to being harassed by police officers. You're immune to being followed around in the store. You're immune to being suspected of things you haven't even done just because of the way you look. And so maybe for people who don't get the idea of white privilege, maybe they can wrap their brains around the idea of white immunity. But what it means is that you are protected from some of the disadvantages that Black people are regularly experiencing simply because you're white, not because you were born extra smart or extra talented, but simply because you're white.
You know, in my experience, I found people don't understand it because they think that it has something to do with not having a difficult life or struggling.
Yes. And that's what I mean by white immunity. Because, or that phrase that my colleague has coined, or the privilege, it doesn't mean, when we say privilege, we think of having special benefits. But there are special benefits to being able to rent an apartment without having someone tell you it's already been rented because they don't want to rent to you. It is a special privilege, though you might not experience it that way, of being able to walk in and ask for a loan and being able to get a good credit rate, knowing that a Black person with the same income and same credit score might be offered that loan at a higher interest rate than you're being offered. So these are things that, again, you might not even be aware of, but they are real.
Got it. All right, we're going to see if Pastor A is able to hear us today. Pastor Adrian, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me, though?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a delay, but I can accept that.
Okay.
Okay, so
All right, I'll take that.
Okay, we are talking about white privilege, and we're kind of going into microaggressions a little bit too. And I just wanted to see if you had any comments about that.
No, I agree with what's been said, but I think part of the success of racism and its enormity. When I hear that people don't think that they have privilege or they don't understand it, it's a very complex and a very layered fabric. It's so enormous. One person could have never done this. It's something that has to happen over years and over years and over years. So I think as African Americans, we're kind of overwhelmed by the many evil tentacles of which I think white privilege is one of those particular arms. It's difficult to know which tentacle to fight first, if that makes sense. And it's also very difficult for us to understand what progress is from one perspective or another. Also, I'm reminded of a quote that Malcolm X says, "If you stab me in the back with a 9-inch knife and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress."
Right.
And so for the person who stabbed you, perhaps they look at that as progress because they're withdrawing the knife, but the knife is still in you. And so I think that it's hard for them to see. I've heard Dr. Tatum speak before about it. This is something that inherently is part of your life. It's very hard for you to take a step back from that to realize if you've always been 6'2", it's that's your perspective. That's what you see, and you don't know what it's like to be 5'2". So we're going to have to address all aspects of this. Of the tentacles that go with racism, systemic racism in this country, and it'll probably have to be someone else's job to really to tie the fabric of all these efforts together to make sure that it has a larger impact on the entire system. It's a very difficult thing to work through.
I like that metaphor. I definitely like that metaphor. Carmen, you're 2020 HBCU grad from Hampton University, and you're living in Atlanta in Georgia. So, of course, you know about the 6 officers who were charged and 2 of whom were fired after they busted the car window, pulled 2 students, tased a Spelman and Morehouse student. What are other students saying about this and the protests?
Well, for one, I think seeing that video, it actually took me a while to watch the entire video because 2 seconds before the 2 students got pulled out the car, you actually see a white female come out the car and wave her hand. And I think that just goes to show exactly what we're going through with those officers pulling those students out of the car and tasing them. And I think for the friends and the women that I've talked to, it's like that could have been me, truthfully. That could have been me and a friend driving downtown, going to protest, sitting in the car or leaving the scene, getting pulled out of that car, getting tased for doing nothing, for the color of my skin. And I think seeing that, it puts you in that perspective. This could have been me. This could have been any of my brothers or sisters. And I think we can no longer be asleep about it. We have to wake up. We have to see that this could affect anyone. This could affect your son. It could affect your daughter, your cousin, your mother, your father, your son. I have 2 nieces. It could affect any of us. So with us being open to the conversation and giving out that knowledge and not ridiculing people for not knowing or not understanding. I think that one thing I do love about my generation is that we're willing to educate others about the topic. We're no longer just going to be like, well, that doesn't involve us, so we're not going to speak up about it. We see our own image within them. Those two students went to Morehouse and one went to Spelman. So I saw myself within them going to an HBCU, being from Atlanta. So I think it's time for a change. And with that video, it showed that we really need to change and it has to get better. It has to.
Well, absolutely. And since you're a HBCU student and Dr. Tatum's the former president of Spelman, do you have any questions for her?
I actually do have a question for you. So you were president of Spelman College for 13 years, and my sister actually went there. She's a 2009 graduate of Spelman, so I've actually heard about you before. So with you being president for 13 years, how do you think HBCUs should make a statement, if they should put out a statement, and how do you believe they should go about it?
Well, actually, I do know that the presidents of the AUC institutions, Spelman, Morehouse, Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse School of Medicine, did put out a statement in which they really, of course, condemned the racism, but also supported the right of students to protest. And Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell, the current president of Spelman College, put out a statement again in support of the Spelman student and her Morehouse friend, who, after they had this experience and the officers were fired, now being prosecuted, really commending the students for their courage and also commending the city, the city leadership, the mayor, the police chief, for their swift action.
Okay. Well, moving on to a big statement that we had yesterday, President Obama made a statement during his My Brother's Keeper town hall meeting. And here's a part of actually what he said.
They've also been an incredible opportunity for people to be awakened to some of these underlying trends. And they offer an opportunity for us to all work together to tackle them, to take them on, to change.
So, Dr. Tatum, I'll send this to you. He spoke about police reform and his 24th century task force. Do you think that this is a helpful solution?
It's not the only solution, but certainly, as Pastor A was saying, this is a big problem and we all have to work on our piece of it. So, having a task force is important. In your local communities, I heard a news story a few days ago about the fact that only 40% of police departments across the country report their statistics about instances of police violence and disaggregating that data. So that's something that any citizen could ask, is my police department keeping track of what's happening? How do we know whether it's getting better or worse if we're not collecting the data? And as an example, each of us in our own communities can be asking about policies and practices that will make a difference over time. So, it is a big problem, but each of us has a sphere of influence. And if we use it as effectively as we can, and I'm encouraged by what Carmen was saying in terms of the young people and their commitment to change, we have to just practice it every day. It can't just be, this week, next week, and then it falls away. We have to keep the pressure on through our voting behavior, through our advocacy, through our letter writing, through our what we speak up about in our workplaces and in our houses of worship and in our families and communities. It's going to require a collective and consistent effort across a lot of different sectors.
Got it. Pastor A, I want to ask you, certainly we have to pray for the hearts of hatred to be changed, but you have a Wall Street background, and I know Black Wall Street is near and dear to your heart. What do you think that has to do with the solution?
Well, I don't know how many people know about that, but I mean, obviously it's something to behold. It's something that we really needed to reflect on. I don't know if you had a clip or not about that, but this this is a part in time that really kind of shook me. Is 1921, one of the worst incidents that, in American history, and many people don't even know about it. It really was a massacre. Maybe more than 300 Black people who were doing well in their own segregated community. They were all professionals and fairly wealthy. They were among the wealthiest people, wealthiest Blacks in the United States. And over a disagreement or a misunderstanding, the whites in the neighboring community came over and basically slaughtered these people and wrecked their homes and their property. And it's if you go through history, you don't even find it as a massacre; you find it as a riot. And that was even something that was done so that they wouldn't be able to come back and try to get any type of reparations for the property that was lost. I think there are some valuable lessons that can be learned from that. One of them, beyond just a lesson of what hatred can do, is to think about the way forward for us. To think about the way forward for us cannot be just social. It cannot be one dimensional. It has to be social economic. I think that we need legislation. I heard the doctor say that as well. We do need to have better written legislation to help us and to look out for us and to protect us. But that's just one aspect of it. We also need to vote to replace the judges and the DAs in our local government that don't honor the legislation that has been written and don't have a history of deciding against people. The ones that have a history of deciding against people of color need to be removed, and we can remove them. We do have access. We do have powers that we do not take advantage of, and that's one of the things that came out of this too. You can see that us immobilizing was a power that we don't often take advantage of. Reminds me of also of when Dr. Martin Luther King was shot. We rioted for 6 days or more, and then some legislation was passed. So not only do we need to pass legislation, but we need to make sure that the people who enforce that legislation are also people who look out for our best interests. But the last thing I would say is that we also need to make sure that we become economically independent, like when you look at Black Wall Street. The way for us to do that, it's not as difficult as you might think it is. Actually, we're still among the highest consumer in the United States, but we still make the least amount out of most classes in the United States. And this is what's so interesting to me. For every $100 that a white family would have, that same Black family, their counterpart would have $5.04. That's staggering. And then with that $5.04, we're still among the highest consumers in the country. So we do need to save, but we also need to reroute our spending to Black-owned businesses that support our communities, the communities that we live in, to help create Black wealth. This is something that we can do much better than we have been doing, and it's a long game play that we can do, because you do know that many of our government is still run. We do think it's about politics, and we do think it's about people, but large organizations and companies and corporations still do run the country. And so when we do have wealth, then we can also attack a lot of the problems that we're talking about today and dealing with today from a financial strong point, as opposed to being the poorest class, which is systemic of a myriad of other problems that we have to deal with.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do have a clip from 1921, one of the worst incidents in racial violence in American history. Here is Black Wall Street.
Hundreds of white people descended upon Black Wall Street, armed. Black residents withdrew behind the railroad tracks that marked off the Greenwood district. Some of them were armed and fought back, but they were outnumbered by the white mob, which shot their way through. The white mob murdered, they looted, and they set fire to Black Wall Street.
Now, this is a part of Tulsa history, like you said, Pastor A, that a lot of people don't know about. They try to, suppress it for many, many years. LeBron James is actually going to be making a documentary about this community. Is there something you're talking about the Black dollar and Wall Street? So I have to follow up with: do you think that Blackout Tuesday is successful, or does it work?
Is that a question for me or the?
It's for anybody, whoever wants it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the social media aspect of it, it does galvanize people together. I do think part of the problem of the social, the hashtag issue is that the people who are reluctant to get involved and to do anything it does pacify them in some way that makes them feel like they did something by posting something. And this is the type of thing that you do have to get up out of your seat and do something. You have to be uncomfortable. Perhaps this time, this is something it's such an important issue. When you think about the many trips that you've taken as an African American, when you had the fear of police or what might happen, or your children leaving the house, you can afford to be uncomfortable now to make sure that generations that come after you are not uncomfortable. And so one of the things that we can do is our dollar, it does matter. We can keep our dollar and decide where we want to spend that dollar differently. And I can tell you, just from a banking standpoint, we will see very fast results if we're able to galvanize the forces that we saw in the streets to do something as it relates to economics, as opposed to just having a show of force and just showing up and standing. That there's one voice that matters, but this is a capitalist society, and I can tell you, if you keep your dollar in your pocket, you will see there'll be people paying attention to you who were not paying attention to you before. And if you decide to take that dollar and to use it for a Black business or to keep it in your community, like our Jewish brothers and sisters, where a dollar changes hands 15 times within the same community, ours only makes one transaction and it's out of our community. This is something that we can change.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of call this weekend, even in our Hampton Roads area. Folks were upset with Wendy's and Chick-fil-A, et cetera. And some people were actually not going to those businesses because they had, different beefs with local communities. Dr. Tatum, do you think something like this would work if people are putting their money not where we want them to put their money?
Well, we know that there's a history of effective boycotting, right? We know the history of the Montgomery bus boycott and the fact that the transportation company was losing so much money because Black people were refusing to ride, that it led to a change in policy. That was a long time ago, back in the 50s, but the principle still applies, that when companies feel that their bottom line is being threatened, it does often cause them to change course, to do something different, to pull their advertising from offensive programming. When people rise up and say, I'm not going to use your product if you continue this advertising in a way that is demeaning to my community, as one example. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious to ask a question of Carmen, because it seems to me that also one of the things that's so important in this election year is that young people turn out to vote. We know that the turnout, the youth vote was missing in action to some degree in 2016. But this, as many people have said, is probably the most important election of our lifetimes, in the history of our democracy, perhaps even. And so I am wondering, Carmen, if you are seeing enthusiasm about going to the polls in November in your cohort of friends and acquaintances.
Well, that's actually funny that you mentioned that, because I just mailed off my preliminary ballot yesterday. So within me and my friend group, I'm very active and adamant about the importance of voting, and that our vote truly does count. I think within my generation, there was a time where people felt like, well, why should we vote? People aren't going to listen to us, especially within our local elections. People are just like, there's no point. But we do have a voice. We do matter. Our voice matters. So going out to the polls, I think now, especially with our current climate, people are going to be more enthusiastic with going out to the polls and vote, because we have to elect people within these positions who is going to care for us, who isn't going just to care for the people who look like them. When you become president, when you become mayor, when you become within any leadership or political position, you have to care for everyone. It's not just about people who look like you, who have the same ideas, the same religion, the same sexuality. It's important to care and support others. So I think the enthusiasm is rising, because now we're seeing this is our time for our generation. We have to go out and vote to the polls. Our vote does count. It doesn't matter. We have to go. And I think more than ever now, we're seeing that is so important and so vital to just go out there and truly do your part.
Well, that's very encouraging. Thank you.
And Carmen, I have a follow-up question for you about the Black dollar, because I know during the whole Pizza Hut No, I'm sorry. Excuse me, Pizza Hut. During the whole
Papa John's.
Thank you. Papa John's pizza. I need pizza. Papa John's pizza. You know, I mentioned to some young folks, hey, do you realize what's going on with Papa John's? And they were like, well, I like Papa John's. I'm ordering Papa John's. You know, I mean, we have these companies and folks aren't willing to take that step and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to hold my, you know, few dollars and I'm going to get pizza somewhere else where people appreciate me or they value my, you know, spending money on their products. Do you think that your generation, I mean, you're from cancel culture, but like folks weren't not canceling Papa John's.
Right. Well, I'm definitely from the cancel culture generation, but I think that it's important that we educate others on these companies who truly don't support us. With the use of social media and us being a social media age and generation, people have had lists of companies that do support us, that have come out with Black Lives Matter in the protest. And then there's the companies who hasn't supported us. Wendy's actually came out with this statement. They came out with a few tweets saying that everything people were saying that they donated to Trump's administration and things like that, they came out by saying that it wasn't true. So we see that when we speak to these companies and when we see that we are affecting them, they're kind of being forced to speak up, which is kind of a counteractive because it's like, did you speak up because you truly believe it and you support the movement, or you're just trying to save face? I think that's also something that our generation is doing. We're forcing these companies to speak up and say something because truly, if you're silent, you can't be silent anymore. That's not going to help. We should not give to something or people or a company that does not support us. We shouldn't give to companies that don't have any people of color within their team or anything like that. And I think it's forcing them to wake up and see, okay, we need to change. This isn't going to. This generation is not going to be silent. We're forced to be reckoned with. Like, we're here.
All right. Final thoughts, Pastor A.
I didn't get it. Can you hear me okay now? I don't know if you can. Okay, I didn't get a chance to speak on my thoughts about why this particular loss of life in our community was a catalyst for things. And I'm interested in what the panel would think about this too. I think it's a combination of many things. In truth, it's not the first time to me, and I did hear one of the answers, it's not the first time that African Americans have seen confirming video with our own, video that confirms what our eyes and our lives have beheld for a lifetime.
Right.
That we get treated in a particular way. But I do think that the quarantine caused by the pandemic also played a pivotal role. And we'll never be able to unbraid this to figure this out. But in two ways. One, I think it put whites and blacks, Black Americans in an unusual place. It put us all home. We were all in our homes, in front of our TVs, in front of our computers, with no place to go, and we got a chance to witness that very clear video, as you said, Doc, and we were able to see that with a fresh perspective, because it was not just life as usual for us. We weren't all caught up in the rat race. We were all sitting in an unusual place. Life had slowed down. It had quieted down, and it was an opportunity for us to look at things differently. The pandemic had already put us in a place where we were actually acting on behalf of all people as a whole. I will say that African Americans are probably a lot more comfortable with being uncomfortable than our white counterparts are. And as if a system won't let you breathe, it certainly won't let you talk. So we're grateful that they started talking after they got a chance to see this with great repetition as much as we do. The second piece of this I was going to say is that after being in the house for 90 days in the quarantine, perhaps, it did fulfill some unconscious need for many people to be social, to congregate, and to connect with other people on a driving force for the common good of all people. And so I think that might have played a role. I don't know that we get the same result from something that has happened so frequently as the death of a Black man by the hands of people who are supposed to protect them. I don't know if we get the same result if the pandemic is not partnered with this at the exact same time. I'd be interested to know what you think about that.
Well,
Anybody
I would
want that
agree. Yes, I would agree that has played a role for some of the reasons that you identified. And also, if we think about just the pandemic itself, we've been hearing about the disproportionate impact of the pandemic in African American communities, less easy access to healthcare, differential treatment when trying to access healthcare. I've been reading stories about Black people who went to the hospital and were turned away because they weren't perceived as being sick enough, and yet then going home only to die without any attempted treatment. So things like that, and also the differential impact of relief efforts, that government funds to help replace payroll payments, the PPP money, has been going to white-owned organizations much more freely than it's been going to Black-owned businesses. So the differential treatment in places where it's so important in terms of people's ability to just survive on a day-to-day basis has been threatened by the pandemic. And then you also see death at the hands of police funded by your tax dollars. And so all of that coming together, I think, has been perhaps a volatile combination.
Yeah, yeah. Carmen?
Truthfully, I agree with everything that you guys are saying. Being from the social media generation, us being home, and school was out for most people, honestly. So we didn't have to wake up for classes unless you're taking summer classes. So we're always on social media. We're always on Twitter, Instagram. Some people use Snapchat or Facebook. So there was honestly no way that you could not have seen that video, only if you chose not to see it. And I understand that could be extremely traumatic for some people to watch. And it took a little time for a lot of people to fully watch that video, and some people could only watch a little because it is a very graphic video, but it will make you uncomfortable to the point where for us, it was like, this is it. Was just coming back from seeing the Ahmaud video with that being on tape. And then this happening, it's a aching feeling to know that nothing has changed. The hands up, don't shoot. Nothing has changed. People kneeling. Nothing has changed. So now it's like we have to shake people and say, wake up. What does it take for us to change? What is it going to take for Black people not to be seen as a target, for us not to be seen as people who you're fearful of, people who you don't want to support? So with us being at home, I truly believe COVID-19 has opened a lot of people's eyes. You have to see the good in every situation. With us being home and us being on our phones, it forced us to see this video, and it forced us to have a dialogue like this.
Yeah, yeah. Pastor, I'm going to give you the final word because I need some hope.
I can't. Unfortunately, I can't hear anything that Carmen is saying, and I really am upset about it because I can see her hands moving, and I'm like, oh, it's going to be good. I would say, obviously we all need prayer right now. I think that we need to believe in something much bigger than ourselves. John, 17 and 21 comes to mind. Father, make us one. Make them one as we are one. We just need to be on one accord. And this, to me, even while I'm saying that, and I know we're concluding, so I don't want to start another conversation. But church is still one of the most segregated places that there is. Every Sunday morning, you can find that, and so I'm hoping that there's an opportunity here for us to reach across. We talk about reach across the aisle to work with people who believe differently than we do. It's a wonderful time for us also to just people of faith, people who are faith-based, for us to really live what we preach. For us to really do what we say. When we say, love your neighbor as yourself, let's really look at that. It's such a simple statement. There's some monotony to it because we've heard it so frequently, but we really do need to really take this to heart and understand that we need to extend the type of love to people that we really want to receive ourselves.
All right, good word there. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you to Dr. Tatum and Adrian and Carmen Jackson. I really appreciate you all being here. And just keep in mind that we only get better if we have the conversation, even in the midst of chaos. And next week, we'll be talking about law and order. I hope you'll join me. And please share this video with the hashtag conversation and the hashtag race and unrest. Thank you so much.